At my granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that said, "The old lady paying for all of this." I smiled when I read it, but something inside me went cold. I'm Evelyn Whitmore, and at 67 years old, I thought I understood my family. I thought I knew the difference between love and obligation. That night, standing beneath crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom of the Ashbury Hotel in Hartford, Connecticut, I realized I had spent years confusing the two. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know what city you're watching from, because sometimes the people closest to us can become strangers without us noticing. The ballroom looked beautiful when I arrived. Soft ivory roses lined the entrance. Golden candlelight reflected against polished marble floors. Waiters in black jackets floated through the crowd carrying trays of champagne flutes, while a string quartet played near the staircase. My granddaughter Sophia had always dreamed of a wedding like this. Elegant, expensive, perfect, and I had paid for nearly all of it. I stepped toward the reception table, smoothing the sleeves of my navy silk dress. It had belonged to my late husband's favorite designer boutique in Boston, and although I rarely spent money on myself anymore, I wanted to look dignified for Sophia's big day. The young woman behind the check-in table smiled politely as she searched through a stack of name cards. "Here you are, Mrs. Whitmore," she said cheerfully. I took the card without thinking. Then I looked down. The words were written in delicate gold script. "The old lady paying for all of this." My fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. For a moment, I honestly thought it had to be a mistake. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade somewhere behind me. I read it again slowly, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. "Is everything all right?" the girl at the table asked nervously. I forced a smile. "I'm sure it's fine." My voice sounded calm. Too calm. I pinned the tag to my dress with careful fingers and walked inside the ballroom as if nothing had happened. That was the strange thing about humiliation. Sometimes it didn't arrive like a slap. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wrapped in pretty handwriting and surrounded by fresh flowers. Across the room, I spotted my son Richard speaking with several guests near the bar. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, silver beginning to appear at his temples just like his father. Beside him stood Pamela, my daughter-in-law, wearing a champagne-colored gown with crystals sewn along the neckline. She laughed loudly at something one of the guests said, then glanced toward me. For just a second her eyes dropped to my name tag. I saw it then. That tiny flicker of satisfaction she tried to hide. "Evelyn," she called brightly as I approached. "Doesn't everything look incredible?" "It does," I answered softly. Richard kissed my cheek distractedly before turning back toward his conversation. Pamela adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. "Sophia wanted everyone to have fun little personalized name tags," she explained with a light laugh. "You know how young people are these days. Fun little personalized name tags." I nodded politely while a waiter offered me champagne. Around us, guests smiled and admired the decorations. Somewhere near the dance floor, Sophia posed for photographs beneath a massive arrangement of white orchids I had personally paid to upgrade because Pamela insisted the standard floral package looked cheap. I suddenly remembered every check I had written over the past 11 months. The venue deposit, the catering balance, the designer invitations flown in from New York, the custom honeymoon package to Italy. Each time Pamela had promised, "We'll never forget your generosity, Evelyn." But standing there with that name pinned to my chest, I realized something painful. They hadn't seen generosity at all. They had seen access. A resource. A walking account balance with silver hair and polite manners. I lifted my champagne glass and took a slow sip. The bubbles burned slightly going down. Near the entrance, two women whispered while glancing in my direction. One of them laughed quietly behind her hand. Then I heard the sentence that changed everything. "Without her money," the woman murmured, "this wedding wouldn't even exist." I stood near the edge of the ballroom holding my champagne glass carefully with both hands while conversations floated around me like soft background music. Nobody noticed the difference in my expression because women my age become invisible in rooms like that. People see the pearls, the silver hair, the polite smile. They stop looking any deeper than that. A jazz trio had replaced the string quartet now, and the dance floor shimmered beneath warm amber lights while waiters carried plates of filet mignon and roasted potatoes from table to table. Everything looked flawless, expensive, curated. Exactly the kind of wedding Pamela had insisted Sophia deserved. I watched my granddaughter laugh beside the photographer near the floral arch. She looked beautiful in her satin gown, radiant in the careless way only young women in love can be. And for a moment I tried very hard to focus only on her happiness. But then Richard walked onto the small stage near the center of the ballroom and tapped his champagne glass with a spoon. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" he announced warmly. The guests slowly quieted. Pamela moved beside him, smiling brightly while adjusting the microphone stand. "We just want to thank all the people who made tonight possible," Richard continued. "Especially family." My stomach tightened slightly. I already knew where this was going. Pamela reached for the microphone with a playful grin. "And of course," she said dramatically, "we could never forget the true sponsor of the evening." A few guests laughed softly before she even finished speaking. Then she looked directly at me. "Evelyn Whitmore," she announced proudly, "the woman who made sure none of us had to eat dry chicken tonight." More laughter. Louder this time. My fingers pressed harder against the stem of my glass. Around the ballroom, heads turned toward me with amused smiles. Some guests clapped politely. Others exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether they should laugh or not. I smiled anyway. That was what women like me were trained to do. Preserve the atmosphere. Protect the family image. Absorb discomfort quietly so everyone else could continue enjoying themselves. Richard raised his glass toward me. "Thanks, Mom," he added casually. "You really came through for us." Came through for us. Not thank you for your generosity. Not thank you for spending nearly $200,000 on your granddaughter's wedding after retirement. Just came through for us. Like I was a bank loan approved at the last minute. Pamela leaned toward him and whispered something that made him chuckle under his breath. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the tone. Familiar. Dismissive. The kind people use when discussing someone they no longer fully respect. I lowered my eyes toward the table in front of me. The ivory tablecloth. The crystal centerpieces. The gold-trimmed place settings I had personally upgraded, because Pamela said the original package looked too plain for social media photos. Across the room, I noticed several younger guests taking pictures of the reception signs and decorations. One woman even photographed my name tag while laughing quietly with her husband. I suddenly felt tired in a way sleep could never fix. Harold Bennett appeared beside me holding a tumbler of bourbon. He had been my husband Charles's attorney for over 30 years, and unlike most people in that ballroom, he still looked at me like a person instead of a resource. "You all right, Evelyn?" he asked quietly. "Of course," I answered automatically. Harold glanced toward the stage where Pamela continued speaking dramatically about wedding expenses and family generosity. His jaw tightened slightly. "Charles would not have liked this," he murmured. I looked down at my untouched dinner plate. "Charles always believed Richard had a good heart," I said softly. "Maybe he still does," Harold replied carefully. "But good hearts can become weak when surrounded by greedy people." I did not answer, because deep down I already feared he was right. A slow song began playing near the dance floor while guests returned to their conversations. Sophia and her new husband started their first dance beneath soft golden lights. Everyone watched them with admiration. Everyone except Pamela, who had quietly slipped toward the gift table near the ballroom entrance. From where I stood, I watched her glance around before opening several envelopes and sliding thick stacks of cash into her designer purse. Quickly, efficiently, like someone performing a routine task she had done before. Then she smiled brightly as another guest approached her. And somehow that small moment unsettled me far more than the name tag ever had. The rest of the evening moved around me like a beautifully choreographed performance that I no longer understood how to join. Music drifted through the ballroom while guests laughed beneath crystal chandeliers, and servers cleared half-finished wine glasses from the tables. Every few minutes someone approached me with the same practiced smile. "Everything is absolutely stunning, Evelyn. You must be so proud. What a generous grandmother. Generous grandmother." They all said it as if generosity were my entire personality, as if I existed only to finance moments other people wanted to remember. I sat quietly near the back corner of the ballroom beside a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas, and watched Sophia dance with her new husband beneath the soft glow of hanging lights. She looked happy, truly happy, and that complicated everything. Because despite the humiliation pressing against my chest all evening, I still loved her. I still remembered the little girl who used to run barefoot through my garden in Martha's vineyard, while holding sticky popsicles in both hands. The child who once climbed into my lap after thunderstorms because she was afraid of the sound of thunder against the windows. Back then, she used to call me her safe place. Somewhere along the way, I had become something else entirely. A sponsor. A financial solution. A polite old woman with an open checkbook. I slowly folded my dinner napkin across my lap and glanced toward the sweetheart table where Pamela sat surrounded by bridesmaids and expensive flower arrangements. She looked perfectly comfortable in that ballroom. Confident. Admired. Important. People like Pamela always understood how to control a room without appearing controlling. She had mastered that skill years ago. First, I thought she simply had strong opinions. Then I thought perhaps she was ambitious. By the time I understood what she truly was, my son had already built his entire life around keeping her happy. Mind if I sit here? Harold Bennett asked quietly. I looked up and nodded. He lowered himself carefully into the chair beside me, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit jacket. His expression remained calm, but I could sense tension behind it. Harold had known my husband Charles since college. The two of them built Whitmore Financial Group together, out of a small office in Hartford nearly 40 years ago. Harold had watched Richard grow up. He had attended every holiday dinner, every graduation party, every summer gathering at the lake house. He was not simply our attorney. He was family in every way except blood. You have barely touched your food, he observed gently. I glanced down at the filet mignon sitting untouched on my plate. I suppose I lost my appetite. Harold remained quiet for a moment while dancers moved slowly across the ballroom floor. Finally, he leaned slightly closer. Charles updated certain legal documents before he passed away, he said carefully. Did he ever discuss that with you? I frowned faintly. Not specifically. He handled most of the trust paperwork himself toward the end. Harold nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. There were reasons for that. Before I could ask what he meant, applause erupted near the dance floor. Pamela stood near the large projection screen smiling brightly while a wedding coordinator dimmed the ballroom lights. We have a little surprise slideshow for everyone, she announced happily into the microphone. The screen flickered to life behind her. Childhood photos of Sophia appeared first. School pictures, family vacations, birthday parties. Guests smiled warmly as sentimental music played overhead. Then the images shifted. Suddenly a photograph of me appeared on the screen from earlier that evening. I was standing near the ballroom entrance holding my champagne glass with my name tag clearly visible against my navy dress. Large decorative text appeared beneath the image. Our favorite family bank. Laughter rolled across the ballroom. Not cruel laughter. Worse. Comfortable laughter. Casual laughter. The kind people allow themselves when they believe humiliation is socially acceptable. My face remained perfectly still. I took a slow sip of water and set the glass back onto the table without making a sound. Across the room Richard laughed too. Only briefly. Only for a second. But long enough for me to see it. And in that moment, something inside me finally settled into clarity. Harold stared at the screen in disbelief before turning toward me. Evelyn, he said quietly, did Charles ever show you the final codicil attached to the family trust? The laughter faded slowly around the ballroom, but the words on that projection screen stayed fixed in my mind long after the slide changed to another smiling family photograph. Our favorite family bank. Such an ugly sentence wrapped in playful humor. The guests returned their attention to the dance floor, relieved the awkward moment had passed. People are very good at pretending cruelty is harmless when expensive wine and soft music are involved. I kept my posture straight and folded my hands carefully in my lap while Harold watched me with growing concern. No, I answered quietly. Charles never mentioned a codicil. Harold loosened his tie slightly and glanced toward Richard across the ballroom. My son stood near the bar laughing with two business associates, while Pamela spoke dramatically to a group of bridesmaids beside the cake display. Neither of them looked remotely uncomfortable. That hurt more than the slideshow itself. Because shame only matters when people still possess enough conscience to feel it. Your husband came to see me about 8 months before he died, Harold said carefully. He was worried. I looked at him for the first time since the slideshow ended. Worried about what? Harold hesitated. About you. A waiter approached offering coffee service, but Harold waved him away gently. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the silver in Harold's hair as he lowered his voice. Charles noticed certain patterns after Richard married Pamela. The spending, the constant requests, the pressure surrounding family money. Stared down at the untouched wedding cake placed in front of me. White buttercream roses. Gold detailing. Another $6,000 added to the final bill, because Pamela insisted the original cake design looked too simple for photographs. Richard has always enjoyed expensive things, I said quietly. There is a difference between enjoying comfort and feeling entitled to someone else's sacrifice, Harold replied. His words settled heavily between us. Across the ballroom, Sophia danced slowly with her new husband, while guests surrounded them holding phones in the air. She looked emotional now. Happy tears glimmered beneath the lights as the photographer circled them carefully. For a moment I envied her certainty. Young people still believe love automatically protects families from becoming transactional. Age teaches otherwise. A few weeks before Charles passed away, Harold continued softly, he amended the Whitmore family trust. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of my napkin. Why? Harold looked directly at me. Because he believed you were being emotionally manipulated. I almost laughed at that. Not because it sounded ridiculous. Because it sounded painfully accurate. Suddenly memories began surfacing one after another with uncomfortable clarity. Pamela insisting the wedding venue had to be upgraded because the original ballroom looked dated. Richard casually mentioning how embarrassing it would be if certain relatives thought the Whitmores could no longer afford elegance. Sophia apologizing sweetly before asking whether I could cover the rehearsal dinner after all because everyone was already expecting something beautiful. Each request had sounded temporary, reasonable, loving even. But standing there now, I realized every conversation revolved around one assumption. Evelyn will pay for it. Evelyn always pays. Harold reached inside his leather briefcase and carefully removed a folded document. Charles included a protection clause within the trust, he said quietly. One specifically tied to public humiliation and financial exploitation. I looked at the papers without touching them. He actually used those words? Not directly, Harold answered. But the meaning was very clear. The music shifted again as guests gathered near the stage for speeches. Pamela adjusted the microphone while smiling elegantly toward the crowd. She looked radiant beneath the chandelier lights. Confident. Untouchable. What happens if the clause is triggered? I asked softly. Harold studied my face carefully before answering. Beneficiaries who intentionally humiliate or financially abuse. You can lose access to substantial portions of the inheritance. For several seconds I said nothing at all. The ballroom noise faded once more into soft, meaningless sound. Somewhere nearby, champagne glasses clinked together. A bridesmaid laughed loudly. The scent of expensive roses filled the air. I thought about Charles then. The way he used to reach for my hand beneath restaurant tables. The way he once told me after Richard's wedding 15 years ago, "You are too kind for people who confuse kindness with weakness." At the time I thought he was being overprotective. Now I wondered how much he had already seen. Pamela tapped the microphone lightly. "Before we continue," she announced warmly to the ballroom, "I think we should all thank the woman who made tonight possible." Applause began spreading through the crowd again. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the stage. Then very carefully, I folded the trust document closed and placed it inside my purse. The applause rolled across the ballroom in warm polite waves while Pamela stood beneath the chandelier lights smiling, as if she had just delivered something heartfelt instead of humiliating. I rose slowly from my chair because everyone expected me to stand. That was the role assigned to women like me. Smile gracefully. Accept the attention. Pretend public embarrassment feels like affection when it arrives wrapped in expensive decorations and family language. I lifted my champagne glass slightly toward the crowd. "Thank you," I said softly. My voice barely carried across the room, but people clapped anyway, Relieved the moment remained pleasant instead of uncomfortable. Then I sat back down while Pamela continued speaking about love, family, and new beginnings. Every sentence sounded polished, rehearsed, empty. I no longer listened carefully. Instead, I watched faces. That was what changed after Harold showed me the trust document. Suddenly I noticed things I had ignored for years. Richard checking his phone impatiently during conversations unless money was mentioned. Pamela monitoring guests constantly to see who mattered socially. The way certain relatives approached me only when bills arrived or invitations needed funding. Once you recognize manipulation, it becomes impossible to unsee. Dinner service ended shortly after the speeches. Waiters cleared dessert plates while the band transitioned into louder music for dancing. I excused myself quietly and walked toward the terrace outside the ballroom. The cool Connecticut night air felt sharp against my skin after hours beneath warm lights and crowded conversations. Beyond the terrace railing, the city glowed softly in the distance while luxury cars lined the entrance below. Somewhere inside, people laughed loudly enough for the sound to drift through the open ballroom doors. I rested my hands lightly against the stone railing and closed my eyes for a moment. "Grandma!" Sophia's voice startled me gently. I turned and found her standing in the doorway holding the edge of her wedding gown carefully above the floor. Up close, she suddenly looked younger again. Less polished. Less certain. "There you are," she said softly. "I have been looking everywhere for you." I smiled faintly. "You should be inside enjoying your wedding." She stepped beside me on the terrace and glanced toward the ballroom. "I am enjoying it." But something in her voice sounded fragile. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sophia looked down at her hands. "I did not know about the slideshow picture," she admitted quietly. "Or the caption." I studied her carefully. Her eyes looked sincere. Nervous. "Did you know about the name tag?" I asked gently. Sophia hesitated too long before answering. "Mom said it was supposed to be funny." Funny. That word again. Cruelty becomes very convenient once people rename it humor. "And what did you think?" I asked softly. Sophia swallowed hard. "I thought maybe it was a little much." A little much. I almost smiled at how carefully young people soften uncomfortable truths when they are afraid of conflict. The terrace doors opened again behind us. Pamela stepped outside holding a champagne flute, her expression immediately brightening when she spotted us together. "There you are," she said warmly to Sophia before turning toward me. "Evelyn, everyone keeps asking where you disappeared to." "I just wanted some air," I answered calmly. Pamela nodded while adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "Well, people really appreciated your generosity tonight." She smiled as though generosity were the only valuable thing about me. Sophia shifted uncomfortably beside us. Pamela noticed immediately. She always noticed weakness in a room faster than anyone else. "Sweetheart, the photographer is waiting for family portraits," she said smoothly. Sophia nodded and glanced at me once more before returning inside. The moment the terrace doors closed behind her, Pamela's smile faded slightly. "Not completely. Just enough. You know," she said lightly, "people our age understand playful teasing better than younger generations." Our age. Pamela was 43. She still considered me part of some separate category of humanity. Elderly. Harmless. Manageable. I looked at the ballroom through the glass doors. Richard stood near the bar laughing with guests while servers poured another round of champagne. "Do you ever worry about pushing too far?" I asked quietly. Pamela blinked once, surprised by the question. Then she smiled again. "I honestly do not know what you mean." Of course she did not. People who slowly use others rarely consider themselves cruel. In their minds, they are simply entitled. Pamela lifted her glass toward me slightly. "Tonight is about family," she said. "And family takes care of each other." I held her gaze calmly. Families also protect each other from humiliation. For the first time all evening, her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Just for a second. Then the smile returned. But now I had finally seen what lived underneath it. The rest of the wedding passed in a blur of music, camera flashes, and carefully rehearsed smiles. I stayed until the final dance because leaving early would have created questions, and people like Pamela preferred controlling the narrative before anyone else had the chance to. Around midnight, Guests began gathering their coats while hotel staff quietly cleared centerpieces from the tables. Richard hugged me near the ballroom exit with one arm while checking his phone in the other hand. "Thanks again for everything, Mom," he said distractedly. Sophia really got the wedding of her dreams. I looked at my son for a long moment. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years. He looked tired now in ways money could not hide. "I hope it was worth it," I answered softly. He barely reacted. Either he did not notice the meaning beneath my words, or he no longer listened closely enough to care. Pamela kissed the air beside my cheek before stepping into the waiting limousine with Sophia and the bridal party. "Drive safe, Evelyn," she called brightly. "And get some rest. You deserve it after financing an entire royal wedding." Several people nearby laughed politely again. I smiled once more because sometimes silence says more than anger ever could. The drive home to my house in Greenwich took a little over an hour. Rain had started falling lightly against the windshield, while the highway lights blurred softly in the darkness. I sat in the back seat of the town car with Harold's folded trust document resting inside my purse like something alive. My house looked enormous when I arrived. Quiet. Empty. The kind of silence only widows truly understand. I walked through the front door slowly, setting my heels beside the staircase before turning on the kitchen light. The marble counters gleamed beneath the soft overhead lamps. Fresh flowers from the wedding still sat wrapped on the island where the delivery service had dropped them off earlier that morning. White roses, hydrangeas, orchids, flowers paid for with my money so other people could feel elegant for one evening. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat alone at the kitchen table while rain tapped gently against the windows. For the first time all day, nobody was watching me. Nobody expected me to smile. Nobody needed anything signed or funded or rescued. I opened my purse carefully and removed the trust document again. The pages felt heavier now somehow. I read every line slowly beneath the warm kitchen light. Charles had been meticulous. There it was in plain legal language. Protective clauses, restrictions, conditions involving emotional mistreatment and financial exploitation against surviving beneficiaries. Harold had not exaggerated anything. My husband had seen this coming before I ever did. That realization hurt more deeply than the humiliation itself. Because Charles knew me well enough to understand I would continue giving until someone forced me to stop. My eyes drifted toward the family photographs lining the far hallway. Richard at 12 years old holding his first baseball trophy. Sophia as a little girl sitting beside me on the porch swing at the lake house. Christmas mornings. Graduation parties. Vacations in Maine. We looked happy in every photograph. Maybe we had been. Or maybe families slowly become transactional so gradually that nobody notices until respect disappears completely. My phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter. A message from Pamela appeared across the screen. "Just wanted to say thank you again for making tonight possible. Everyone said it was the most beautiful wedding they have ever attended. No apology. No acknowledgement. Nothing about the slideshow or the name tag or the jokes. Because in Pamela's mind, none of it qualified as cruelty." I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone face down without replying. Then another notification appeared. This time from the bank. Unusual activity alert regarding Whitmore Family Holdings. My stomach tightened instantly. Charles and I had maintained several connected business accounts tied to the family trust for decades, though Harold handled most oversight after Charles passed away. I opened the banking application slowly and reviewed the activity history. Multiple large transfers had been initiated over the past 6 months. Wedding vendors. Luxury purchases. Private account movements I did not recognize. Some transactions carried authorization signatures under Richard's credentials. Others originated from a subsidiary account connected to Pamela's consulting business. I stared at the numbers quietly while rain continued falling outside the dark kitchen windows. Tens of thousands of dollars. Then hundreds of thousands. Carefully scattered across months so no single withdrawal looked alarming on its own. A strange calm settled over me then. Not panic. Not grief. Clarity. The kind that arrives only after denial finally collapses. I reached for my phone again and scrolled slowly to Harold Bennett's number. It was nearly 1:30 in the morning. I knew I should wait until morning. Instead I pressed call. Harold answered on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep but immediately alert. Evelyn. I remained seated at the kitchen table staring at the glowing numbers on my phone screen. I think you need to come by tomorrow morning, I said quietly. There was a brief silence on the line. What happened? I started reviewing the family accounts. Another pause. Longer this time. Do not move any money tonight, Harold said carefully. Do not contact Richard or Pamela yet either. Let me look at everything first. I agreed softly before ending the call. Then I sat alone in the kitchen until nearly dawn while the rain continued falling outside. Strange how betrayal changes the atmosphere of a house. Rooms begin to feel different. Photographs lose warmth. Even silence sounds heavier somehow. The next morning Harold arrived just after 9 carrying 2 leather folders and a slim silver laptop. Martha, my housekeeper of 20 years, served coffee quietly before leaving us alone in the sunroom overlooking the back garden. Gray clouds still hung low above the trees, and the hydrangeas near the stone walkway swayed gently in the damp wind. Harold reviewed the financial records for almost an hour without speaking much. The only sounds came from pages turning and occasional keyboard clicks. Finally, he removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair. This is worse than I expected, he said quietly. I folded my hands carefully in my lap. How bad? Harold slid several printed statements toward me. Richard has been pulling money from secondary trust accounts for at least 3 years. Some of it was technically authorized under discretionary family spending clauses, but the volume is excessive. He tapped another page with visible frustration. Pamela also appears to have used one of the holding companies to secure private lines of credit. I stared at the documents while sunlight shifted faintly across the carpet. Numbers filled the pages in neat organized rows. Luxury travel expenses, designer purchases, transfers between corporate and personal accounts, hidden debt disguised beneath temporary reimbursements. Charles had spent 40 years building stability for this family, and somehow Richard and Pamela had treated it like an endless fountain with no bottom. Did Sophia know? I asked softly. Harold hesitated before answering. I honestly cannot tell. That uncertainty hurt more than certainty would have. Over the following weeks I changed very little on the surface. That was important. People reveal more when they believe you remain unaware. I still answered Richard's calls politely. I still attended Sunday dinners occasionally at their house in Westport. I still smiled through conversations about honeymoon photographs and future vacation plans. But quietly, carefully, I stopped behaving like their safety net. The first change happened when Pamela emailed asking whether I could cover the balance for additional wedding photography edits, because the premium package had exceeded budget estimates. For years, I would have transferred the money immediately without hesitation. This time I simply replied, I think it would be wise for you and Richard to handle that expense yourselves. The response arrived 12 minutes later. Oh, we were just surprised since you offered to help with everything. Offered. Such an interesting word. As though generosity, once given, became permanent obligation. A few days later Richard called asking whether I could temporarily loan him $30,000 because one of his investments had become tied up. I sat quietly in my library while listening to him explain cash flow issues with increasing irritation. In his voice, I am not comfortable doing that right now, I answered calmly. Silence filled the line instantly. Richard almost never heard the word no from me. Mom, he said carefully, it is temporary. Then temporary solutions should be manageable. Another silence. Colder this time. You have plenty of money, he replied finally. Not you are financially secure. Not you can afford it. Simply, you have plenty of money. As though my resources existed automatically for family extraction. That may be true, I said softly. But I also have boundaries. He ended the call less than a minute later. Small cracks began appearing after that. Tiny shifts in tone. Fewer cheerful messages. Delayed responses. Pamela stopped sending me social invitations unless money was involved somehow. At Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, I noticed tension between Sophia and her new husband over honeymoon expenses. Richard looked distracted the entire evening while checking emails repeatedly beneath the table. Pamela drank more wine than usual, and kept forcing bright conversation whenever silence settled too long. The illusion of effortless luxury was beginning to strain around the edges. After dessert, Pamela followed me into the kitchen while I wrapped leftover pie slices in foil. "I hope you understand families help each other sometimes," she said lightly while leaning against the marble counter. I folded the foil carefully before answering. "Families also respect each other." Her smile thinned almost invisibly. "I think you are overreacting to harmless jokes at the wedding." I looked directly at her then. Calmly. "People reveal themselves most honestly when they believe there will be no consequences." For the first time since the wedding, Pamela said nothing at all. 3 weeks after the wedding, Harold scheduled a formal trust review meeting at his office in downtown Hartford. He insisted every primary beneficiary attend in person. Richard sounded irritated when he called me the night before. "Is all of this really necessary?" he asked. I stood in my bedroom folding sweaters carefully into drawers while speaking on the phone. "Apparently Harold believes it is." Richard exhaled. Sharply. "This feels dramatic." Dramatic. Another interesting word people use when consequences begin approaching. "Then perhaps tomorrow will clear everything up," I answered calmly. Harold's office occupied the top floor of an older limestone building overlooking Bushnell Park. Charles always loved the place because it reminded him of old New England stability. Dark wood shelves, leather chairs, quiet hallways that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The kind of office built before modern people started confusing luxury with noise. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing a cream cashmere coat and carrying a slim folder beneath my arm. Harold greeted me quietly before leading me into the conference room. Sunlight filtered through tall windows across the polished mahogany table, where neatly organized legal documents waited beside crystal water glasses. Richard and Pamela arrived together several minutes later. Pamela wore a tailored white suit that looked intentionally expensive. Richard looked exhausted. Tiny shadows had settled beneath his eyes over the past few weeks, and his usual confidence now appeared strained around the edges. Sophia entered shortly afterward with her husband beside her. She hugged me softly before sitting down without speaking much. The atmosphere felt different now. Less polished. Less certain. Harold closed the conference room doors carefully before taking his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," he began professionally. Pamela crossed one leg over the other and smiled politely. "Hopefully this will not take too long," she said lightly. Harold ignored the comment. He adjusted his glasses before opening the first folder. Following recent financial reviews and concerns regarding the administration of Whitmore Family Holdings, it has become necessary to formally revisit provisions within the Whitmore Family Trust. Richard leaned back in his chair immediately. "Defensive already? This is because Mom suddenly stopped helping financially, correct?" he asked. I said nothing. Harold remained calm. "This is because multiple clauses within the trust may have been violated." Silence settled heavily across the room. Pamela's smile faded first. "Violated," she repeated carefully. Harold slid several financial statements across the table. "Over the past 3 years, unauthorized patterns of financial dependency, reputational humiliation, and exploitative conduct have been documented involving Mrs. Whitmore." Richard looked genuinely stunned now. "Exploitative conduct?" he said sharply. "We are her family." Harold nodded once. The trust anticipated that possibility. He opened another document slowly. Several amendments were personally added by Charles Whitmore before his passing. These amendments specifically protect Evelyn Whitmore from emotional manipulation, public humiliation, and coercive financial reliance by beneficiaries. Pamela straightened in her chair. "This is ridiculous," she said with a small laugh. "Nobody manipulated Evelyn." Harold calmly pressed a button on the remote beside him. A projection screen lowered slowly near the far wall. Then images appeared. The wedding name tag, the slideshow caption, bank transfer histories, expense records, messages requesting money, screenshots, dates, amounts, patterns. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even Richard looked pale now. Pamela stared at the screen in disbelief before turning toward me. "You recorded all of this?" she asked quietly. "No," I answered softly. "You created it yourselves." Harold continued reading from the trust documents in an even measured tone. Any beneficiary found to have knowingly humiliated, exploited, or financially abused Evelyn Whitmore may have their inheritance rights reduced, suspended, or permanently revoked at trustee discretion. Pamela laughed suddenly, but the sound lacked confidence now. You cannot honestly be serious. Harold removed his glasses slowly. I am entirely serious. Richard rubbed both hands across his face before looking at me directly. Mom, he said carefully, this has gone too far. I held his gaze calmly. No, Richard. It went too far at the wedding. The room fell silent again. Sophia stared down at the table with tears gathering quietly in her eyes. Her husband placed a hand gently over hers. Harold slid the final document forward. Effective immediately, he said. Richard Whitmore and Pamela Whitmore are suspended from discretionary trust distributions pending final review. Additional estate privileges, including secondary property access and investment authority, are also revoked. Pamela stood abruptly from her chair. This is unbelievable, she snapped. After everything we have done for this family. I looked at her quietly across the polished table. That is exactly the problem, I said softly. You started believing this family existed to serve you. Richard opened his mouth as if searching desperately for the right words, but none came. Because deep down he knew. He remembered the jokes, the pressure, the assumptions, the years of treating my kindness like permanent obligation. Harold gathered the documents carefully while silence swallowed the room once more. Then I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the sleeve of my coat before speaking one final sentence. Your father spent years trying to protect me, I said quietly to Richard. I finally understand why. Winter arrived quietly after the trust meeting. The trees outside my Greenwich home stood bare against pale gray skies while the first thin layer of snow settled across the garden paths Charles once helped design by hand. For the first time in years my house felt peaceful again. Not happy exactly. Healing rarely feels happy in the beginning. Feels quiet. Honest. Clean. Richard called several times during the first month after Harold suspended the trust distributions. At first his messages sounded defensive. Then frustrated. Then apologetic in the careful unfinished way people apologize when they still hope money will eventually return. I listened politely without promising anything. Pamela never called me directly again. But I heard enough through relatives to understand their situation had changed quickly. The Westport house was suddenly more expensive than they could comfortably maintain without trust support. Credit balances grew. Investments Richard once described confidently turned unstable beneath pressure. Invitations to certain social events quietly stopped arriving once people realized the Whitmores were no longer spending freely. Wealth attracts admiration very easily. Stability attracts far fewer people. One snowy afternoon in early January, Sophia came to visit alone. Martha let her inside while I sat near the fireplace reading beneath a cashmere blanket. She looked different somehow. Softer. Less polished than the young bride who once posed beneath ballroom lights surrounded by expensive orchids. Marriage had already introduced her to realities photographs never capture. Hi, Grandma, she said quietly. I closed my book gently and smiled. Hello, sweetheart. She sat across from me in silence for several moments while snow drifted steadily outside the tall windows. Finally, she lowered her eyes toward her hands. I owe you an apology. I said nothing. Sophia swallowed carefully before continuing. I should have stopped them at the wedding. Her voice trembled slightly now. I knew some of the jokes were wrong. I just kept telling myself it was easier not to make a scene. I studied her quietly across the warm firelight. Young people often confuse silence with peacekeeping. They do not realize silence can also become participation. I spent so much time trying to keep everyone happy, she whispered. I did not notice what it was costing you. That sentence mattered because it was honest. Not defensive. Not strategic. Honest. I reached for my teacup slowly before answering. People reveal themselves most clearly when money enters the room, Sophia. Tears gathered softly in her eyes. Are you angry with me? I considered the question carefully. Outside, wind moved gently through the snow-covered trees while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily behind us. No, I answered truthfully. But I think you needed to understand what respect actually looks like. She nodded slowly. I understand now. And for the first time since the wedding, I believe someone in the family finally did. Over the following months, life became smaller in ways that felt unexpectedly beautiful. I traveled less extravagantly and more intentionally. I spent a week in Vermont reading beside snowy windows at a quiet inn Charles once loved. I attended charity board meetings again without feeling distracted by family tension. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected while constantly rescuing other people from their financial emergencies. Most importantly, I stopped apologizing for having boundaries. That changed everything. One evening in early spring, Harold joined me for dinner at the lake house. The water reflected soft gold beneath the sunset while we sat on the porch wrapped in light sweaters against the cool breeze. You seem lighter, he observed gently. I smiled faintly. I think I spent years carrying responsibilities that never truly belonged to me. Harold nodded once. Charles worried kindness would become your burden. I looked out across the calm water quietly. Maybe kindness is only dangerous when given without limits. We sat in comfortable silence after that while distant lights flickered across the opposite shore. Somewhere nearby, wind moved softly through the trees. Peaceful. Uncomplicated. Mine. Later that night, after Harold left, I walked slowly through the lake house, turning off lights one room at a time. Near the hallway mirror, I caught sight of my reflection and paused. Silver hair. Fine lines around my eyes. A woman no longer trying to earn love through sacrifice. For years, my family believed I was simply the elderly woman paying for everything. What they never understood was far more important. I was also the woman who owned everything. And finally, after all those years, I remembered that included my dignity too.